There is a home movie from the early 1920s, flickering and grainy, capturing the Kennedy children as they sprint across the emerald lawns of Hyannisport. They are a blur of white linen and sun-kissed skin, a physical manifestation of American vitality. In the center of the frame, there is a young girl with thick, dark hair and a smile that seems, at first glance, to be the brightest of them all. She is beautiful. She is sturdy. She is a Kennedy. But if you watch the footage closely, if you stop looking at the myth and start looking at the girl, you notice the stagger. You notice the way she trails just a half step behind her brothers, her eyes searching their faces for a cue on when to laugh, when to run, and how to belong. Her name was Rosemary Kennedy, known to the world as Rosemary. For decades, she would become the family's greatest ghost, a name whispered in the hallways but scrubbed from the public record. She was the eldest daughter of Joe and Rose Kennedy, born into a dynasty where winning wasn't a goal, it was the only acceptable biological function. But buried under the touch football games and the sailing trophies was a secret that the Kennedy machine wasn't built to handle. This is the story of the girl who was told she had to be perfect in a family that decided her soul was a defect. Rosemary's story began with a choice made in the dark. On September 13th, 1918, as the Spanish flu ravaged Boston, Rose Kennedy went into labor. The doctor was delayed, and the nurse, terrified of a delivery without a physician, instructed Rose to keep her legs closed. For 2 agonizing hours, the force of nature was fought with the force of will. Rosemary's head was held in the birth canal, deprived of the very oxygen that fuels the human brain. It was the first time a Kennedy life was sacrificed for the sake of procedure and proper appearance. When she finally arrived, she was a beautiful, healthy-looking infant. The damage, silent and microscopic, had already been done. As the 1920s roared, the Kennedy household became a laboratory for ambition. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. was building a financial empire, but his real product was his children. He viewed them as an extension of his own power. Joe Jr. was the hero, Jack was the intellectual, Kathleen was the socialite, and Rosemary? Rosemary was the puzzle. By the age of 5, the gaps began to show. While her siblings mastered complex games and debated politics at the dinner table, Rosemary struggled to hold a pencil. She was slow to walk, slow to speak, and prone to irritability, a word the Kennedys used to describe the profound frustration of a child who knows she is failing a test she doesn't understand. But Rose Kennedy, the matriarch, was a woman of iron discipline and terrifying Catholic stoicism. To Rose, a slow child was not a tragedy to be nurtured, it was a social liability to be managed. She began a lifelong project of normalization. Rosemary was sent to different schools, tutored privately, and pushed into the same grueling schedules as her high-achieving siblings. The goal was never to help Rosemary find her own path. The goal was to make sure the neighbors didn't notice she was different. Imagine the psychological weight of that childhood. Imagine being a young girl in a house where your worth is measured by your speed and you are inherently, biologically slow. Rosemary spent her youth in a state of permanent performance. She was taught to mimic the grace of her sisters. She was dressed in the finest silks and pearls, her hair coiffed into a perfect halo, and told to stand still, to smile, to look like the others. In the Kennedy world, weakness was the only sin. Joseph Sr. famously told his children, "Kennedys don't cry, they don't fail, they don't lose." And so Rosemary learned to hide her struggle behind that famous Kennedy smile. She became an expert at passing. She would attend the parties and the galas, standing at the edge of the room, a beautiful mannequin in a world of high-speed actors. But the irritability was growing. By the time she reached her teens, the frustration of the performance began to leak out. There were tantrums, there were moments of defiance. To an outsider, it was a young woman seeking autonomy. To the Kennedys, it was a crack in the porcelain. The family was moving toward the world stage. Joe Sr. had his eyes on the White House, if not for himself, then for his sons. The stakes were becoming global. The brand was being polished to a mirror shine. And in that mirror, Rosemary's slowness looked like a smudge. They began to ship her away to convents, to special schools, to any place where the walls were high and the tongues were tied. The tragedy of Rosemary Kennedy isn't just what happened to her in the end. It's the 10,000 small erasures that happened in the beginning. It was the way she was loved only to the extent that she could pretend to be someone else. She was a girl who loved music, who loved to dance, who had a sweet, affectionate nature that didn't care about power or prestige. But in the House of Kennedy, sweetness was not a currency. By 1930, the shadow was lengthening. Rosemary was 12 years old, entering womanhood in a family that demanded she be a queen, while her mind was still trying to navigate the basics of being a child. The pressure was building, a hidden tectonic shift that was about to fracture the family's carefully constructed reality. Because soon the Kennedys would be sent to London. They would be the most famous family in the world, and Rosemary would be forced to step into the light of the British court, a place where one wrong step wouldn't just be a mistake, it would be a scandal. The girl hidden from the world was about to be given her greatest role yet, and the cost of that performance would eventually lead to a room, a doctor, and a knife. By the mid 1930s, the Kennedy ambition had outgrown the shores of Massachusetts. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. was no longer just a wealthy businessman. He was a political titan, and in 1938 he achieved what many thought impossible for an Irish Catholic. He was appointed the United States ambassador to the court of St. Pierre, James. For the Kennedy family, London was not just a diplomatic posting, it was a coronation. The move to England transformed the family from American aristocrats into global royalty. The British press fell in love with them, the nine-child power family, as they were called. They were vibrant, attractive, and seemingly perfect. But for Rosemary, now 20 years old, London was a gilded cage with a spotlight that never turned off. The stakes of her performance had shifted from the dinner tables of Port to the ballrooms of Buckingham Palace. In May 1938, Rosemary and her sister Kathleen, known as Kick, were to be presented to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. This was the ultimate social test, an ancient ritual of grace, lineage, and poise. For months, the two sisters practiced their curtsies. They were taught how to glide, how to tilt their heads, and how to manage the heavy 3-foot-long trains of their court gowns. If you look at the photographs from that day, the image is breathtaking. Rosemary stands tall, her chin slightly lifted, draped in white lace and silk, a tiara nestled in her dark waves. She looks every bit the debutante. She looks, to the untrained eye, like the most successful version of herself. But behind the pearls, Rosemary was terrified. She knew that a single stumble, a single moment of slowness, would not just be a personal failure, it would be an international embarrassment for her father. The presentation was, by all public accounts, a triumph. Rosemary performed the deep, floor-sweeping curtsy perfectly. The newspapers praised the beautiful Kennedy daughters. For a brief, shimmering moment, the normalization project seemed to have worked. Joe and Rose Kennedy had successfully managed to present their daughter to the highest society in the world without anyone suspecting the truth. But the victory was an illusion. The pressure of London, the constant social demands, and the biological reality of her maturing body were beginning to create a volatile cocktail inside Rosemary. While Kick was out dancing with British aristocrats and becoming the darling of the London set, Rosemary was becoming increasingly isolated. Her irritability had evolved into something more profound, a desperate, thrashing search for a self that wasn't defined by a script she couldn't read. She was 20 years old, a woman with the physical desires and emotional complexity of an adult, but with the cognitive processing of a child. She began to slip out of the embassy at night. She would wander the streets of London, seeking a connection. Any connection that didn't feel like an exam. For the first time, the Kennedy parents faced a threat they couldn't simply tutor away: Rosemary's burgeoning sexuality. In the 1930s, for a family with presidential aspirations, a daughter who was difficult was a problem. A daughter who was promiscuous or uncontrolled was a catastrophe. The fear in the Kennedy household wasn't just for Rosemary's safety, it was for the image. They feared she might be taken advantage of, or worse, that she might cause a scene that would reveal the defect in the Kennedy bloodline. As the clouds of World War II gathered over Europe, A different kind of storm was breaking inside the Kennedy family. Joe Sr. began to see Rosemary not as a daughter to be protected, but as a ticking time bomb. The gentle Rosemary was disappearing, replaced by a young woman who was prone to violent mood swings and fits of rage, largely because she was being asked to do the impossible every single day. When the war finally broke out in 1939 and the family was forced to return to the United States, the transition was devastating for Rosemary. She was sent to a convent in Washington, D.C., away from the siblings she adored, away from the only world she knew. The court was over. The gowns were packed away, and in their place was a growing, desperate silence. Joe Kennedy was watching his sons climb the political ladder. Jack was graduating from Harvard. Joe Jr. was preparing for greatness. The brand was about to become the most powerful force in American politics, and Rosemary, the girl who had curtsied for the king, was now the only thing standing in the way of the myth. The decision that would change everything was no longer a matter of if, but when. And as Rosemary's behavior became more erratic in the isolation of the convent, her father began to look for a permanent solution. A way to fix the girl who wouldn't stay hidden. By 1941, the world was at war, but the private war inside the Kennedy family had reached a breaking point. Rosemary was 23 years old. To the public, she was still the radiant debutante who had charmed London, but behind the closed doors of her new residence in a Washington, D.C. convent, the normalization project had utterly collapsed. The irritability of her childhood had sharpened into something the Kennedys could no longer manage with tutors or travel. Rosemary was experiencing violent seizures of rage, thrashing against the invisible walls of a life she didn't choose. She would wander the streets of the capital at night, escaping the watchful eyes of the nuns. In the mind of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., this wasn't just a daughter in distress, it was a political liability. Joe Sr. was a man of cold, mathematical precision. He was looking at his sons Joe Jr., Jack, Bobby, and he saw the future of the American presidency. He saw a legacy that could change the world. And then he looked at Rosemary. In his eyes, her mood swings, her slowness, and her burgeoning, unpolished independence were a stain that could leak into the press and drown the ambitions of her brothers. In 1941, a new miracle was being whispered about in the medical corridors of George Washington University. It was called the prefrontal lobotomy. Its pioneers, Walter Freeman and James Watts, promised a surgical cure for the difficult. They claimed that by severing the connections to the prefrontal cortex, they could calm the agitated and fix the broken. Today, we know it as a brutal, imprecise mutilation of the human soul, but to Joe Kennedy it sounded like a reset button. The most chilling detail of what happened next is the silence. Joe Kennedy did not consult his wife, Rose. He did not tell Rosemary's siblings. He acted with the same ruthless autonomy he used to break unions or buy stocks. He scheduled the surgery for November 1941. Imagine the scene. A sterile room, a young woman who loved to dance and play the piano, and two doctors with a silver scalpel. Rosemary was not put under general anesthesia. The doctors wanted her awake so they could measure the success of the procedure in real time. They asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer, to tell stories, to sing. As they pushed the instrument into her brain and began the rhythmic cutting of her frontal lobes, they watched her. They waited for the moment the agitation stopped. They kept cutting until Rosemary began to incoherent. They kept cutting until she couldn't speak anymore. They kept cutting until the vibrant, struggling, complex young woman was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out silence. The surgery was a catastrophic failure. It didn't fix Rosemary, it erased her. When the bandages came off, the girl who had curtsied for the King of England could no longer walk. She could no longer speak more than a few words. She had the mental capacity of a 2-year-old. She would spend the rest of her life staring at walls, unable to control her own basic functions. The problem was solved, but the person was murdered. And then the second erasure began. Joseph Kennedy didn't bring his daughter home. He didn't ask for the family's forgiveness. Instead, he had her moved to a private psychiatric hospital in upstate New York and later to St. Livell. Coletta's School for Exceptional Children in Wisconsin. For the next 20 years, Rosemary Kennedy effectively ceased to exist. Her name was scrubbed from family conversations. Her siblings were told she had become reclusive or was teaching in the West. The Kennedy myth was entering its most powerful phase. The Camelot era was on the horizon. But in a quiet room in the Midwest, the girl who started it all was sitting in a chair, forgotten by the very people whose names she shared. The secret was buried deep, protected by the same iron will that had authorized the knife. But secrets of that magnitude have a way of haunting the people who keep them. And as her brothers rose to the highest offices in the land, the ghost of Rosemary Kennedy began to flicker in the peripheral vision of the American dream. If the knife was the crime, the next 2 decades were the cover-up. Following the catastrophic failure of the lobotomy in November 1941, Rosemary Kennedy did not return to the fold of her family. She did not go back to the sun-drenched porches of Hyannisport or the bustling dinners in Washington. Instead, she was moved under the cover of darkness to Craig House, a private psychiatric hospital in Beacon, New York. She was 23 years old, and for all intents and purposes, her life as a Kennedy had ended. In the eyes of her father, the project of Rosemary was over. She was no longer a person. She was a mistake to be filed away in the back of the cabinet. For the next 7 years, Rosemary lived in New York, largely ignored by her parents. Joe Sr. never visited her, not once. Rose Kennedy, the mother who had spent years obsessing over Rosemary's normalization, also stayed away. It is one of the most chilling aspects of the Kennedy saga, the sheer clinical detachment with which they severed their ties to the daughter, who no longer fit the brand. But as the 1940s progressed, the Kennedy family was struck by a series of genuine public tragedies, the kind the world was allowed to see. In 1944, Joe Jr., the golden son, was killed in a plane explosion over the English Channel. In 1948, Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy, the rebellious darling of London, died in a plane crash in France. The family was reeling, draped in black, mourning their heroes and their stars. And yet, through all the funerals and the international headlines, no one mentioned the sister who was still alive, sitting in a locked ward just a few hours away. In 1949, Joe Sr. moved Rosemary again, this time to St. Coletta's School for Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin. He chose it for its distance and its discretion. He funded the construction of a private cottage for her on the grounds, staffed by nuns who were sworn to a silence that would last for decades. Rosemary had gone from the court of St. Last, James, to a small brick house in the middle of a Wisconsin field. Her world had shrunk from the global stage to the dimensions of a single room. During these years, the Great Disappearance became a masterpiece of public relations. When reporters or friends asked about Rosemary, the family had a rotating set of scripts. She was reclusive. She was teaching. She was working with the sick. The lies were told so often and with such conviction that even the younger Kennedy siblings, Bobby, Jean, Ted, and Eunice, began to lose track of where their sister actually was. They were children of a dynasty where the father's word was law, and the father had decided that Rosemary was a closed chapter. Meanwhile, John F. Kennedy was beginning his meteoric rise. He moved from the House to the Senate, his path cleared by the relentless machinery of his father's money and influence. The Kennedy style was becoming the new American ideal. They were the family of the future, vigorous, intellectual, and physically perfect. But imagine the irony of those years. As Jack campaigned on vigor and new frontiers, his sister was relearning how to hold a spoon. As the family sat for Life magazine portraits glowing with health and dental perfection, Rosemary was struggling to walk a straight line in a hallway in Wisconsin. The contrast was a haunting subtext to the Camelot myth that was being built. The Kennedys' success was predicated on the idea that they were genetically superior, a royal bloodline for a democratic nation. Rosemary was the living proof that the bloodline was human, fragile, and capable of breaking. By the late 1950s, as Jack prepared for his run for the presidency, the secret of Rosemary was more dangerous than ever. If the truth about the lobotomy and the father who authorized it had leaked, it could have ended the Kennedy political dream before it truly began. In 1960, the year of the election, Rosemary was 42 years old. She had spent nearly half her life in institutional exile. She had been erased so thoroughly that when Jack was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States, the world truly believed there were only 8 Kennedy children. Rosemary was a ghost, a shadow lurking behind the heavy velvet curtains of the White House. But the silence couldn't last forever. The siblings who had been told to forget were starting to grow up, and they were starting to ask questions. The wall of the Great Disappearance was about to develop its first cracks. And the person who would eventually break it down wasn't the father who built it, but the sister who had never stopped looking for the girl who loved to dance. In January 1961, the Kennedy family reached the summit of the American mountain. On a freezing day in Washington, John F. Pence, Kennedy took the oath of office, promising a new frontier to a nation captivated by his youth and his family's seemingly supernatural vitality. But as the flashbulbs popped and the world fell in love with Camelot, the most profound absence in that frozen tableau was a 42-year-old woman sitting in a quiet cottage in Jefferson, Wisconsin. Rosemary Kennedy was the only sibling missing from the inauguration of the President of the United States. For 20 years, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. had maintained a blockade around his eldest daughter. He had been the architect of her disappearance, the warden of her silence. But in December 1961, less than a year into his son's presidency, the patriarch's iron grip was broken, not by a change of heart, but by a stroke. The man who had dictated the reality of the Kennedy family was suddenly silenced, rendered unable to speak or to command, and in the vacuum of his power, the secret of Rosemary began to bleed out. It was Eunice Kennedy Shriver, Rosemary's younger sister, who first dared to reach through the fog. Eunice was the restless Kennedy, a woman of fierce intellect and a deep, pulsing empathy for the vulnerable. Perhaps it was because she had seen the irritability and the slowness of her sister firsthand as a child. Or perhaps she simply couldn't square the family's public rhetoric about helping the common man with the abandonment of their own blood. In 1962, Eunice did something unthinkable in the Kennedy world. She went public. In a groundbreaking article for the Saturday Evening Post, Eunice revealed that the president's sister was mentally retarded, the clinical term of the era. It was a seismic moment in American culture. At a time when families hid their handicapped children in back rooms and basements out of shame, the most powerful family in the world was admitting they were touched by the same struggle. But even then, the full truth was managed. Eunice did not mention the lobotomy. She did not mention her father's role in the surgery. She framed Rosemary's condition as a lifelong challenge from birth, a tragedy that the family had managed. It was a partial truth, a bridge between the old Kennedy silence and a new kind of advocacy. This revelation changed the trajectory of the Kennedy legacy. It was the spark that led to the creation of the Special Olympics. It pushed President Kennedy to sign the first major federal legislation to support mental health and intellectual disabilities. The world began to view the Kennedys not just as icons of perfection, but as a family with a heart for the forgotten. But what of the woman behind the policy? As the 1960s unfolded, Rosemary's siblings finally began to visit her in Wisconsin. One by one, they traveled to St. Coletta's. They found a woman who was a stranger to them. The vibrant, dark-haired girl who had danced in London was gone. In her place was a woman who walked with a heavy limp, whose left arm was curled against her chest, and who spoke in a fragmented, private language of yes and no and humming. The visits were reportedly devastating. To see Rosemary was to look into a mirror and see the cost of the Kennedy ambition. It was to realize that their father had quite literally sacrificed a piece of their sister's soul to ensure the path was clear for the rest of them. Rose Kennedy, the matriarch, finally visited Rosemary in the late 1960s, nearly 20 years after the lobotomy. According to accounts from the nuns, when Rose walked into the room, Rosemary, who usually sat in a state of placid silence, suddenly became agitated. She stood up, her face twisted with a primal, forgotten recognition, and began to strike her mother's chest with her good hand. It was a scream without words. It was the only way she could ask, "Where were you? Why did you leave me?" Rose Kennedy never spoke publicly about that moment. She resumed her role as the stoic mother of the dynasty. But she began to visit Rosemary more often, bringing her silk dresses and pearls, the same proper uniforms of the 1930s, as if she were trying to dress a ghost. By the 1970s, Rosemary was no longer a secret, but she was still a mystery. She had become a symbol for a movement, but her actual life remained small and quiet. She spent her days walking the grounds of St. Coletta's, listening to music and sitting in the sun. She had outlived Jack. She had outlived Bobby. She had outlived the golden era of the family that had tried to erase her. As the world moved into the 1980s, the hidden girl was finally being integrated back into the family she had been severed from. She began to attend family gatherings again, the weddings, the funerals, the summer days at Hyannisport, but she wasn't the Rosemary of the 1930s. She was a living monument to a history that the Kennedys were only just beginning to reckon with. The silence had been broken, but the damage was permanent. And as Rosemary entered her final decades, the question remained: what is left of a person when their past is taken by a knife and their future is taken by a secret? In the final decades of the 20th century, the Kennedy family had become a collection of tragedies and triumphs, a living history book that the American public read with obsessive devotion. We watched the children of Jack and Bobby grow up. We watched the liberal lion Ted Kennedy lead the Senate. We watched the funerals at Arlington. But in the quiet town of Jefferson, Wisconsin, the oldest living Kennedy daughter was doing something that no one in her family was ever expected to do. She was simply existing, away from the cameras, away from the pressure, and away from the myth. By the 1980s, the Great Disappearance had softened into a gentle, belated inclusion. Rosemary was no longer a secret to be guarded. She was a sister to be visited. Her siblings, Eunice, Jean, Patricia, and Ted, became regular fixtures at St. Coletta's. They would fly in from Washington or New York, bringing with them the whirlwind energy of the Kennedy world. They would take her for car rides, play her favorite songs, and sit with her in the garden. But there is a heartbreaking quality to these reunions. The siblings were meeting a woman who was, in many ways, a stranger. The lobotomy had not just stolen Rosemary's cognitive abilities, it had fractured the timeline of her life. While her brothers and sisters had lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Civil Rights Movement, and the moon landing, Rosemary's internal clock had stopped in a sterile room in 1941. She was a woman in her 60s and 70s with the emotional vocabulary of a toddler and the ghost memories of a debutante. Yet, in those final years, something remarkable happened. Rosemary Kennedy, the defect, the mistake, the failed project, became the emotional North Star of the family. Eunice Kennedy Shriver's work with the Special Olympics grew into a global phenomenon. And at the heart of every speech, every race, and every medal was the memory of Rosemary. The sister who couldn't keep up became the reason millions of others were finally allowed to run. The tragedy of the knife was being transmuted into a legacy of dignity for the forgotten. Rosemary didn't have to do anything to achieve this greatness. She simply had to survive. And she was a master of survival. If you look at the rare photographs of Rosemary from the 1990s, the change is profound. The pearls and silk performance of her youth had been replaced by a soft, genuine comfort. She was often seen wearing bright colors, her graying hair cut short, a peaceful, distant expression on her face. She had outlived the father who had authorized her mutilation. She had outlived the mother who had ignored her for 20 years. She had outlived the brothers who were groomed for the presidency. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. died in 1969. Rose Kennedy followed in 1995 at the age of 104. In the end, the woman who was deemed too weak to represent the family was the one with the strongest constitution of them all. Rosemary Kennedy passed away on January 7, 2005, at the age of 86. She died at the Fort Atkinson Memorial Hospital in Wisconsin, surrounded by her surviving siblings Eunice, Patricia, Jean, and Ted. It was a rare moment of Kennedy's private peace. There was no political campaign to protect, no image to polish, and no scandal to bury. There was only a sister, finally letting go of a world that had never quite known what to do with her. She was buried at Holyhood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts, near the graves of her parents. But even in death, the erasure left its mark. For years, her grave remained unmarked, a final shadow of the secrecy that had defined her life. It wasn't until later that a simple stone was placed there, finally acknowledging her name and her place in the lineage. The story of Rosemary Kennedy is often told as a cautionary tale of medical horror or patriarchal cruelty, and it is those things, but it is also a story about the resilience of the human spirit under the weight of a myth. Rosemary was a girl who just wanted to belong, born into a family that demanded she be exceptional. She paid a price for the Kennedy greatness that no one else had to pay, not with a bullet, but with a slow, decades-long disappearance. When we look back at the 20th century, we see the Kennedys as the architects of the American dream. We see the speeches, the space race, and the glamour. But if we listen closely, we can hear the quiet hum of a woman in a cottage in Wisconsin. We can see the girl who curtsied for the king and then vanished into the heart of a secret. Rosemary Kennedy was the girl hidden from the world, but in her silence, she taught us more about the value of a human life than any political speech ever could. She was the dark secret of the American Camelot, and in the end, she was its most enduring survivor. Her story reminds us that beneath the glitter of every dynasty, there is a human cost, and that sometimes the most revolutionary thing a person can do is simply refuse to be forgotten.